What would Jesus Christ say if he could see the church today? What would Jesus say if he saw a long parade of cardinals in red-watered silk cassocks and lace robes? Would he think they were vested appropriately as successors of his apostles? He told his 12 apostles to take nothing for their first journey except a walking stick and a single tunic. Do these men travel in the spirit of the first apostles, or in the spirit of Renaissance nobility? What would Jesus say if he heard the bishops addressed as your eminence or your excellency? Didn't he tell his followers not to be like the Pharisees who demanded titles of honor like rabbi, teacher, master, or even father? What would Jesus say if he saw cardinals in long silk capes parading to seats of honor at ceremonies and styling themselves as princes of the church? Jesus criticized the religious leaders of his own day who demanded seats of honor in synagogues. What would Jesus think if he saw an enormous treasury of paintings, sculpture, jewels, architecture, vestments, books, and precious antiquities accumulated over the centuries by the church? He told us not to store up treasure on earth, where moth and decay destroy and thieves break in and steal, but rather to store up treasure in heaven. What would Jesus say if he realized his church claimed to be a sovereign nation among nations, with all the rights and privileges of a nation state, granted by the notorious fascist dictator Benito Mussolini in 1929 in the Lateran Treaty? He said his kingdom was not of this earth. What would Jesus say if he knew over 11,000 allegations of sexual abuse against children were made against over 5,000 priests in the United States between 1950 and 2019, and that the church has paid these victims in excess of $2 billion? The crimes against children by these Catholic priests are horrific and unforgivable. Abuse perpetrated by clerics, both within and outside the Catholic Church, is especially awful since we hold these individuals to a much higher standard of behavior and trust. And in the eyes of a child and others, clerics are representatives of the divine, the most holy, and of God. The spiritual damage adds to the psychological and physical damage suffered by these victims. Jesus used a child to teach his disciples that childlike faith is necessary for entrance into the kingdom of heaven. At the same time, he said that the Father has concern for all his little ones. In that passage, Jesus says, "But whoso shall offend one of these little ones, which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged around his neck, and that he was drowned in the depth of the sea." These crimes against these little ones were often committed with a full knowledge of the Catholic Church's leadership, that either failed to take appropriate action, or at worst, effectively aided and abetted further abuse by predators. Therefore, in the eyes of the law, the church is held liable in civil court for damages regardless of whether the abusive priest has been criminally charged, died, or left the country.
In this insider-exclusive Justice in America special network TV expose, our news team goes behind the headlines to meet with Michael Weilmuenster, shareholder at Weilmuenster Keck Brown, PC, to discuss how he successfully won a clergy sexual abuse case against a former Catholic priest, Father Raymond Kownacki, and the Diocese of Belleville, Illinois, for $5 million. Michael will explain how the legal precedent set in this case was so groundbreaking that it opened the courthouse doors to hundreds, if not thousands, of childhood sexual abuse victims in the state of Illinois and throughout the country, so they can pursue their claims and have their day in court. And eventually, Governor J.B. Pritzker signed legislation that makes Illinois the 8th state to remove time restrictions on prosecuting crimes of sexual violence. This is the Insider exclusive, live from Belleville, Illinois.
It is my great pleasure to introduce Michael Weilmuenster and Nate Brown to the show. Welcome to the show.
Nice to meet you, Steve.
Mike, tell our audience a little bit about your firm. What do you guys specialize in?
Well, we're trial lawyers. So we represent victims of either automobile accidents, medical malpractice, products liability, and for the last 20 years or so, we've done a lot of work with victims of childhood sexual abuse.
Right. And Nate, you've been with the firm for 15 years.
Sure have, yeah.
Right. And you kind of do the same thing, right?
Yeah. You know, I like this firm because we're a small firm. We work together. We've got another lawyer. We practice as a team. And so, you know, Mike's got a case. I work with Mike. I've got a case. Mike works with me. And so you really get to be creative and step into a lot of different cases.
We are here today to talk about one of your landmark cases. It's a clergy sex abuse case.
The gentleman that we represented, Jim Wisniewski, by the way, my age, only a couple of days off on our birthdays. In early 2000s, in 2002, when the Boston sex scandal became, just blew up and was covered by the media, kind of triggered what had happened to him when he was a kid. And he found me because I had handled an appeal of another case against the Belleville Diocese where this...
Catholic Church.
Yes, yeah, Catholic Church, Catholic Belleville Diocese. And he contacted me, and he learned for the first time that this particular priest, Father Kownacki, had a long history of abuse of minors throughout his whole stay in the Belleville Diocese.
And for our audience, I want you to describe what that history was and what the church, the diocese, was doing, because I found it amazing. He had been in South America before.
Yeah, he was in Guatemala and Mission Zaire, and we find all of this out not by the personnel files that they kept on the priest, but these secret files that they kept. One was a Monsignor who at that time was the bishop's right-hand man and kind of his secretary. He took private notes, and we eventually were able to uncover these. And we found out that they knew that while he was in Guatemala, he had impregnated a young woman. And then when he came back from Guatemala, I think he was there about 5 years, and he came back to the Belleville Diocese, and he brought 2 young boys with him.
How does he get them in the country?
Well, I don't know back then how that, I mean, you're talking in the late 60s.
I mean, you still got customs you have to go through.
Yeah, I don't know if he brought them back. They had family members in the States, and he was going to be a sponsor, but he brought them back with him. And they lived with him in a parish in southern Illinois. And then he got transferred to East St. Louis, Illinois, St. Martin of Tours. And at that time, he then brought a 14-year-old girl with him as his supposed housekeeper.
And again, I got to ask the question, how does he get a 14-year-old girl here because he needs her as a housekeeper when his housekeeper's here?
He tells the parents that he's going to give her a better life, and he's going to educate her, and this is a great opportunity for her. And unfortunately, back then, people took priests for their words, and I thought, well, what could be better than my child spending time with the priest, and he's going to take her on her wing, give her a better life than I can. And then he started to sexually molest her, and eventually her and her family came forward and complained to the diocese. Actually, she was impregnated, and he attempted to abort the fetus by giving some concoction that he said he learned how to brew back in Guatemala. And then that didn't work, and then he physically assaulted her in order to terminate the pregnancy.
And did he effectively do that?
He did.
And he was never charged for that, though, was he?
No.
Okay, well, let's get back to these secret files. How did you discover them?
Well, the Monsignor in question was actually on his deathbed, and he was deposed by another lawyer, not myself. I became involved in that case of the young woman when it was on appeal, and I helped with the appeal because it got thrown out under the statute of limitations. But this Monsignor on his deathbed comes clean and gives a deposition literally from his hospital bed, and tells about these notes that he'd taken, and he not only took the notes, but then he would later type them up. And these were then kept separate and apart from the priest files. So only the bishop and his right-hand man or men would know about it. And I guess his conscience finally got the better of him. So once we uncovered that, that's when we found out that they knew about the abuse in Guatemala. They knew about bringing the boys back. They knew about the young lady that he had living with him in Washington Park.
Let me answer this question. He's telling them his deathbed confession, right? But the files are still existing some other place under somebody else's supervision. How'd you get your hands on it?
Just by digging, and eventually we had a change of bishops, and the bishop at the time was Wilton Gregory, who's now the bishop of the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. And he wanted to kind of find out the truth about what was being now reported about some priest. And so he requested that they comb all the records. And then he found out that they kept information and documents outside of the personnel files of the priest regarding complaints, allegations of misconduct.
Did this represent other priests who had similar behavior?
Absolutely. There was another priest that operated a summer camp in southern Illinois, Camp Ondasak. He was probably the most prolific of the abusers of the Belleville Diocese. And I went to that camp as a child. Most of my friends did. I was born and raised Catholic. And we all kind of knew something was off about the guy because he did spend a lot of time with minors. But again, we found information replete with allegations and complaints of abuse, not only by the kids themselves or their parents or family, but by other priests. And everybody was told to keep it quiet. We don't want to injure the reputation of the Catholic Church.
We don't want to hurt Mother Church.
Exactly.
Okay, so question. You must have run across some people that represented the parish that went out and talked to some of these families. And I know for a fact that oftentimes there were payments made to them to keep their mouth shut.
Well, I don't know that we ever uncovered payments, but it was kind of a carrot and a stick thing, that, this could ruin you and your family if this came out. Plus, we'll keep it quiet. That's best for your young son, that he doesn't have to be exposed to what would be perceived as a very embarrassing situation.
You'll be an outcast, in other words.
Oh, yeah. And an outcast in the Catholic Church, which for some of these families, large Catholic families, that was their social life. You went to fish fries on Friday. Your kids paid sports in the CYO league. That was your whole social identity. And to be ostracized, was something that would just, devastate a family and their community. So they preyed on that as well.
I like that phrase. They preyed on that.
Yeah, exactly.
So ridiculous.
And no pun intended. But so then when we found out about these files, and with regard to this particular priest, we then started to look at the parishes that he was moved. The Belleville Diocese covers all of southern Illinois, so it's a large area geographically. And they would send this priest, in this case, he was at St. Martin of Tours, which is close to St. Louis. And they moved him to Marion, which is in the middle of the southern Illinois.
No warnings, nothing.
No, in fact, quite the contrary.
I'm talking about no warnings to the other parish priests.
Quite the contrary, right? I mean, they would send a letter to be read aloud at the church.
How wonderful he was.
Oh yeah, well, we're appointing this new priest. We commend him to you. You know, he's a representative of the diocese, a representative of the Catholic Church. You know, welcome him with open arms. And of course, you're talking again in the 70s, and you had altar boys, and you had young kids that they would have work around the rectory. And again, parents would think, how safe, you know, what better place that for my son to be instead of roaming the streets, you know, is with a priest and helping a priest out. So in any event, this happened repeatedly. Okay, he would be at a parish for a couple of years, and then he'd get moved, and they'd bounce him from one corner of the state to the next. So we started to piece that together, and then as we started to get more information, and we talked to deposed other priests, we deposed housekeepers of some of these parishes, and we found out about every time that he was moved, it was due to an allegation of sexual abuse.
Right. One of the reasons we do these shows is we look at some of the challenges you encountered. Yeah. When you casually say, when we started to depose the priest, was that difficult to do? What kind of administrative challenges did you have to go to? Did you have to go to the, you know, the head guy at the church? What about that, Nate?
Well, I mean, I think Mike sells himself a little bit short. I mean, you ask, how did we get this information? It's because you got the headstrong lawyers, and you got good judges who are.
So you got to go through their lawyers. You don't walk up to the church and say, "I'm going to depose you here."
None of this information was volunteered.
Yeah.
This is information that was acquired through hours and hours and weeks and months and years of work.
Right. So the intent is people give up. Right?
Yeah.
They give up because they don't see any positive steps forward to getting this resolved.
And again, who's on the other side? It's an institution of faith. It's an institution of God. And so I think you have people who are already in their heads to begin with to say, am I doing the right thing? And that's a part of the challenge that you run into when you do cases like this.
Does the word get around when a family comes forward, even today, when they come forward to the church and say, this priest molested me and my daughter or my son, does the word get around to the other parishioners that this person is not conforming to helping Mother Church?
Now, but certainly not in the past. In fact, some of the priests that I end up deposing are priests that I had known socially. One in particular, who was the vicar general, was very good friends of a family that I were good friends of their children. We kind of grew up together. And he would be at their birthday parties and holiday parties, so I knew him socially. And here I was deposing him and learning all the things that he knew and buried.
Well, how did they say it? I'm just curious.
Well,
you know, you're asked, did you molest this 14-year-old girl? What did they say?
The priest oftentimes, in this case, and this is another point that Nate made that I should make sure we address, is that we had good judges that ordered these priests to come forward and testify, that ordered that documents be produced. This case was filed in 2002. We didn't get to trial to 2008. We went up to the Illinois Supreme Court on a discovery issue, even before the case was tried. I sat across from some of these priests, and they knew what they did was wrong. But it was so ingrained in the Catholic Church that you protect your own. You know, these priests are supposed to, you know, administer to their flock, right? But their loyalty was to, you know, to Rome.
They never really freely admitted.
Oh no.
How would they couch it?
Basically that it was just how we did business.
Yeah. Do you remember I talked to you before the show about Father O'Grady in Stockton, California? And when he went back to Ireland, when he was deported, he came out publicly, and this is the reason
that this documentary was made in 2006. He said, the reason I did this is because I loved you too much. Did you ever hear that?
Well, I didn't hear it, but many of the victims, and whether this was part of the grooming or whether the perpetrator convinced himself, but it was, this is how we show love, and this is healthy for you. This is how grown-ups show their love, and we have a special bond. No, most of the time they're either from broken families or they're from real large families that maybe, you know, they're 6, 7 kids and they kind of get lost in the mix, and the priest becomes kind of a father figure to them, and then so when the priest says that the church condones this is how we show love, the child then thinks, okay, everything's all right, and then conversely they say, if you say anyone, you know, we're going to ruin your family, or their business will be ruined. This particular priest, Kownacki, also kept a gun in his nightstand, and he would show it to his victims if he ever got the inkling that they were now thinking about telling people.
Eventually, after 2008, this case started moving along, didn't it?
So 2008 is when it actually, we finally got to trial in August of 2008. And it was big news locally. It's the first time the Diocese of Belleville, a case had ever gone as far as trial, because most of the cases got dismissed for statute of limitations.
Yeah, and let's stay on that right now, because, you know, there's a lot of people watching the show that don't really understand the statute of limitations. That's really the most important part of this whole case.
It is, because we figured out a way to get around statute of limitations that had precluded other cases.
How was that?
So, really 2 ways. The statute of limitations has what's called a discovery provision. Most statute of limitations do. So it's when you knew or should have known that someone's misconduct caused or contributed to cause you injury. Well, in this case, Jim always knew that Father Kownacki had abused him, okay? But he didn't know anything about the misconduct of the Belleville Diocese.
The fact that they knew.
Exactly. And the fact that their conduct was a cause of his injury. Because not only did they know about it, but they knew about it before he was ever abused. And yet, instead of disciplining the priest, removing him, defrocking him, or at least not allowing him to have access to kids, put him in another assignment somewhere, instead of a parish priest where you're going to be around kids all day. So we alleged that he didn't have any reason to know of the misconduct of the diocese that caused him injury.
So there was no statute of limitations running.
That's right. So it doesn't run, or it's not told until he discovers that.
That was very smart.
Well, you know.
I mean, let's face it, this is the first one that beat the statute of limitations.
It is. And then we had even a more novel approach. Illinois has what's called a fraudulent concealment statute. That if you know that your conduct may have caused some injury, if you misrepresent that, or you take some affirmative action to dissuade the victim from realizing that, then there's a different statute of limitations. It's 5 years from when you discover the fraud. But in this case, it was more through silence than representations, because they failed to inform anybody in these parishes that this guy shouldn't be around their kids, right? So Steve, what we did is we also established that there was a special relationship, though, between the diocese and these boys, because these boys were members of the Catholic Church, they were altar boys, and if there's a special relationship, then even your silence can be viewed as fraudulent concealment. So we were able to sustain a motion to dismiss, motion for summary judgment, and then at trial, the jurors were asked specifically whether or not, fraudulent concealment told the statute. They answered that yes. Whether or not my client knew or should have known of the wrongful conduct of the diocese any time earlier than when he, after retained my services, and the jury found in favor of our client in that respect too.
Yeah, no, Nate, this is where you come into the picture in terms of putting together a PowerPoint. And PowerPoints are used to make presentation, the pictures. You know, they're used to show simply exactly what he's talking about, right? Tell our audience a little bit about putting that together.
Yeah, so, and we deal with this in a lot of complex litigation. We digest these cases over years, and we ask a jury of normal people to listen to the arguments, listen to the dispute, and make a decision. And so how you educate a jury and how you boil down these issues that we have lived with for years into something that they can understand is of utmost importance. And so when you look at this case, we poured over tens of thousands of pages of documents. There's so much information. How do you put that into a format that jurors can understand?
And digest in a short period of time.
I mean, we're talking about decades of misconduct and wrongdoing. And so for opening statement and to guide kind of the course of evidence, we put together a presentation to lay this out in a way that the jury can understand. And we use the documents that we dug up through discovery to tell that story. But you got to have a framework, you got to have a background. And so we spent considerable amount of time trying to figure out, if you're a juror who's going to hear this case, what's the information that you want? What's important to you? And so we allowed a juror's mind to guide that process. And I think as it turns out from the verdict, I think it was very effective.
There was a lot of people that watched this trial, and the jurors were very cooperative afterwards. But they basically said after the opening statement, they'd made up their mind as long as the evidence supported what we said. And the evidence that Nate had put together were documents that we got from the church. Where, you know, they're talking about, what do we do with Kownacki? Where do we assign him now?
So, you know, it's kind of interesting. The case was really not about his misdeeds. It was how to get around and present the case so that a jury can say, yes, the parish was at fault, because they knew, they should have known. They didn't do anything. And the other thing about the fraudulent concealment, right? So my question to you is, for years, none of these cases made it to the surface. So here I'm imagining you one night in your office figuring out, how do I beat these guys? And when did you come up with these novel approaches? And how did you come up with them?
A lot of it stemmed from the appeal that I had worked on before, which again was the young lady that was living with the priest in St. Martin's Parish when she was 14, and he was abusing her and eventually...
The one that beat the child up.
Aborted her child, yeah. So I had addressed the issue already on appeal, including in our appellate division and at the Supreme Court. So I had a good grasp of the obstacles I was facing. So even then, when I was doing the appeal, I didn't do the legwork, the trial work itself. I did the appeal, but I started thinking about ways that we could get around it. And I don't mean around it like we're skirting the law, but using the law as an advocate for our clients to just get them their day in court. And so it was part of that whole process of writing that brief, making those arguments, that I started to consider, if I have another one of these, what am I going to do?
I'm surprised no other lawyer picked up on that.
You know, they're tough cases because a lot of...
And when you say tough cases, you know, I want our audience to know, these are contingency cases.
Oh, yeah.
When you go to represent someone and you're in a trial for, I mean, the whole thing lasts 8, 10 years, right? You're not seeing any money for all the time and the research you're doing.
You advance all the costs and expenses, and you put your time in the hours, in this case, hundreds if not thousands of hours into this. And if you're not successful, you eat it all.
Choose another career.
It's a tough way to make a living. But so that dissuades a lot of lawyers from doing that. But I was born and raised Catholic, and I started to see beyond the facade, and it just it just sucked me in, that I had to find out the truth. And so I think that's why we became so dedicated to this.
And by the way, Spotlight, the movie, that focused on Cardinal Law, who was the Cardinal of Boston at the time. That was way back, 2002? That is 23 years ago. I find there's more cases coming out.
Well, that's the thing about childhood sexual abuse, is that most times victims, for a number of reasons, and I'm not a psychiatrist, but I've heard them, and I've read the books, they don't feel, they're not able to come to grips with what happened to them.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a minute, because I've interviewed a lot of victims. I've seen that some people, many victims, can never have a normal relationship with anybody for the rest of their life. Or they get married and they ended up getting divorced, or they resort to some sort of addiction, chemical addiction, drugs, alcohol. Nobody hears about these people. There's plenty of cases out there where people have died from addiction, all because it started with molestation by somebody.
Correct. And a lot of these kids, they feel somehow guilty, which is hard to fathom, but it's true. And they have then trouble, a lot of times as they get older, there's a triggering mechanism. We've had a number of clients that they had kids of their own. Mm-hmm. And as a matter of fact, just recently we had a case where a young man took his kids to school in a new school district in a new town for the first time and dropped them off and left there and just had a panic attack because he just left his kids at school and it all came back to him, and now he's thinking, what can I do to protect my kids? So what he did was he decided to come clean, so to speak, and try to bring a legal action because he wanted his story to be told and he wanted his kids to be proud of him that he did something about it. But you're right. Substance abuse is a major consequence of childhood sexual abuse. But as I said, for a number of reasons, people don't come forward until they're 30, 40, or 50 years old. Well, by that time, oftentimes the perpetrator's dead, witnesses are gone, so it's kind of tough to make those cases, right? And that's why, as we were talking before this about the major settlement just reached in Los Angeles. People don't realize just how prevalent this is, not only in the Catholic Church, but in the educational institution itself.
Particularly in the Hispanic culture, because they look at the church a little bit differently than, we do, for example.
Well, they look at the church the way many of us Catholics did in the 60s and the 70s and the 50s.
Even teachers. I think the word in Spanish, the equivalent word is master, I believe. How could such a person who has such responsibility violate a child, right?
How could Padre violate a child?
This was the first case that actually succeeded against it.
Correct.
What has been the result since that time?
Well, from a multitude of things, I think. It's opened the doors to a lot of victims to be able to get their day in court. Many states enacted windows where they opened the statute of limitations up for 2 or 3 years so victims would have the ability to seek redress. And recognizing that victims of childhood sexual abuse often aren't in a position to do anything about it until years later when they can face what happened to them and they're in a position to take some action. Illinois, for a number of reasons, has not been able to do that because they had a statute of repose in effect, and I don't need
10 years?
Well, the statute of repose was 12 years initially. Soon, they enacted in 1991. They soon realized that the statute of repose was actually going to preclude many of the people they were hoping to give a window to file a lawsuit under would be blocked, because if no matter what happened, if it was 12 years after the abuse, then your claim would forever be barred. So they repealed it really quickly in 1994, but if you as a defendant had a vested right, in this case a valid defense to any claim under the statute of repose, that could not be taken away from you. So that was challenged many times in Illinois. The Supreme Court has rejected that and said, sorry, that the defendants had a bar at one time. If you repeal the statute of repose, that doesn't open the door again. So this has allowed a lot of people in the state of Illinois, and quite frankly in a lot of other jurisdictions, the two-pronged approach about the institution, in this case the Roman Catholic Church, that you didn't know about their misconduct until you found out about what they knew or did not do in response to these allegations, and then the fraudulent concealment. But from a societal standpoint, this is a very Catholic community here, and in Southern Illinois, and people revered the Catholic Church, and as I said earlier, it's part of their social fabric. And it was tough when I first took this case. My kids all went to Catholic school. They got some negative feedback.
Why is your father doing this?
What's he trying to do? Is it a money grab? And then I think the publicity that this case garnered, it's a spotlight on a much smaller scale, but it did get a lot of publicity both in the St. Louis metropolitan area, and it brought to light undisputed facts, so that people now, when a child says, I was abused by a priest, or a priest did something funny to me, they believe it now. And I think people's eyes have been opened. So I think, it's been significant in that respect as well.
Right. So I got to ask you this question. The Catholic Church is the only church that requires celibacy with their priests. All the other religions, you can be married. Do you think that celibacy has anything to do with this?
I do. I think that's kind of unnatural to be celibate. But I found that a lot of these priests may have been victims of abuse themselves when they were young in seminaries. So that was, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around the fact that you as a victim could then go ahead and do that same heinous conduct perpetrated on someone else.
But it's part of the cycle, unfortunately.
It is. And then since they can't have sexual intimacy with an adult, well, there's easy pickings right there.
Tell our audience a little bit about the new law that Governor Pritzker signed into effect that deals with this matter.
For years, the criminal statute was much more restrictive than the civil statute because, as I said earlier, the discovery provision in the civil statute didn't apply in criminal cases. So most of the time when someone would come forward or a family member would come forward and they'd make a complaint to the local police department, and the state's attorney's office would take a look at it and say, we can't prosecute it because of the criminal statute, so you have no recourse here.
Yeah, it doesn't exist anymore.
I think that's very beneficial for a number of reasons, but one is, the courts have subpoena powers, and they can compel witnesses to talk, and they can do an investigation. And sometimes it's a lot easier for someone to talk to someone with a badge or with the state's attorney's office, staring them in the face than a lawyer like myself. So it's beneficial that these people are not only having the benefit of the government's investigatory powers, but someone's believing them. and saying, we're going to do something about it. You know, I mean, that's the only satisfaction that they can get.
The Catholic Church has paid out something in the neighborhood of, I think, $2 billion to date to all these victims. What changes, Nate, do you see that the Catholic Church has implemented so they don't have to pay out this money? They can stop this abuse.
Yeah. Well, you know, and it started within Father Kownacki's time as a parish priest. First off, recognizing that there is validity and there is truth to some of these stories. And so creating personnel review boards that look into these allegations, again, giving them the time of day and the light of day. I think that's significant.
It's interesting you bring this up because oftentimes with like police misconduct committees, the police investigate themselves, and what do they find out? Nothing, right? So, you know, in big cities like Los Angeles, we have citizens who sit on these committees. When you're talking about review committees, are there lay people sitting on these committees now?
Yes, absolutely.
Now, I will say it is interesting, and this case is an example of that. And I think they have made significant strides since this time. But in the Belleville Diocese, Bishop Gregory instituted a citizen review board to review these allegations. The person who led that review board first saw some of the allegations against Father Kownacki, not through her work on the review board, but through our work in bringing this lawsuit. The files had been whitewashed. And so if you're going to have a review board, you got to make sure that you provide the citizens, the lay people who are volunteering and investing their time, that they have all of the right information to make those very important decisions. I think that there have been significant strides that have been made in that regard. But certainly focusing on the fact that you believe people. You believe people when they come forward, and you invest the time and the energy to make sure that you get it right.
Right. I want to thank both of you for being on the show. You've done a great job. Congratulations on the case.
Well, thank you, Steve. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at insiderexclusive.com.